What's up, y'all? Welcome back to the Mic Check Podcast. It's T Word, the People's Champ, with another quick read. Today, we're going to talk about fighter Errol Spence Jr. and what's next on deck for this seasoned fighter who's also a unified champion, the WBA, WBC, and IBF welterweight champion. And what's next for him after fight talks and a deal to fight WBO welterweight champion for undisputed Terrence Crawford. It just fell apart. As early as May of this year, Errol Spence and his team, Al Heyman and PBC, were negotiating with Terrence Crawford, who is now an independent, once with Top Rank, as many of you boxing fans already know. We won't go too deep into the weeds on that. They were negotiating a deal to try and get a fight done at the end part of this year, and unfortunately, negotiations fell apart. It doesn't mean the fight is completely dead. If you follow me on other platforms, such as the Angry Man podcast, you'll know that we had a little back and forth about whether or not um, Errol Spence and Terrence Crawford are going to fight. Now, while things aren't hopeful at the moment, because Terrence Crawford has moved on and decided to fight David Evanesian on December 10th of this year, and Errol Spence is talking as if he's trying to set something up. Now, all of that said, here's what complicates the matter. The first thing is that when you are a three title holder or multi belt holder, with that comes great responsibilities such as mandatory title defenses. Errol Spence has held the IBF title since 2017. He's held the WBC title since 2019, and he's freshly minted as the WBA champion of 2022. Terrence Crawford has held his title since around 2018, but he's defended his title several times. Errol Spence hasn't defended the IBF title since 2018. He's only defended the WBC title once in 2020 against Danny Swift Garcia. And then this year, he just got the WBA title and inherited mandatory defenses. So when you start to consider the time frame that these men have to fight people in line for shots at the title, the likelihood of a fight between them seems a little bit bleak. But there's some loophole, and there's different ways that unification, aka undisputed fights, will take precedence over mandatories. That's just a general agreement that the sanctioning bodies, WBA, WBC, IBF, and WBO, have come to as they recognize each other as a major title. They recognize unification of those titles over mandatory defenses. And it's good for the sport if one person has the titles, because you don't have all of these alphabet or Mickey Mouse belts running around clouding the judgment of people who aren't fully indoctrinated in the sport and understanding, well, who's the actual champion at each weight division. At 147, you only have two champs. So you can, with confidence, say that those are the two best fighters in the division. Now, for another video, we could talk about where there's some young guns coming up that are going to put some pressure on the older guys to fight for those top spots, including Virgil Ortiz and Jerron Boots Ennis. But we'll talk about that later. Back to the point. So, Errol Spence has these three title defenses. In line for titles are WBA regular champion Imanta Stanionis and number one contender Virgil Ortiz. For the IBF, the number one contender is Jerron Boots Ennis, who, by all accounts, is the next in line to rule the welterweight division. And then the WBC, due to a champion emeritus status that was granted to Keith Thurman when he was injured, he relinquished control of the WBC belt, allowing Sean Porter to win a vacant belt and eventually lose that belt to Errol Spence in 2019. So, with those things understood, you have three men in line for title shots. We can somewhat eliminate two competitors. Virgil Ortiz was the number one WBO ranked fighter behind Terrence Crawford. He's somewhat given up that position in order to fight Virgil Ortiz, in order to fight Imanta Stanionis much sooner, which puts him as a title holder because he'll have the regular title, what many call a secondary or baby belt. Now, what that means is he's going to have mandatories in line because Imanta Stanionis has not defended his belt yet, so he's going to inherit mandatories that Errol Spence is going to be able to skirt past while he pursues undisputed. So we can eliminate two potential high-level welterweights from the conversation, at least temporarily. Now, we're also thinking Errol Spence hasn't fought since April. He's going to want to get into the ring as soon as possible because he is 32 years old and activity really kills the fighters' careers. And just be sure you go ahead and check out our video on fighter activity. Myself and Quinton Lilley, we break it down on exactly what the issue is and why American fighters just don't seem to get in the ring that often. And Errol Spence falls in that group. Um, that leaves a couple other people to talk about. So let's start with one of the least likely outcomes here, and that's going to be Jaron Ennis being granted, or his petition to the IBF being granted to make him a mandatory immediately. He submitted that petition some time ago, just about 30 days, and he hasn't been moved into mandatory status. He's only the number one contender. In most people's eyes, he's the mandatory. If Errol Spence is not fighting Terrence Crawford, he should be fighting Jaron Ennis. And just for full disclosure, he is one of my preferred fighters and one of my favorite fighters. I do favor him most of the time when he enters the ring, and I follow him his entire career. He lives out here in Texas like me, so he's a guy kind of like a homeboy in a way. So of course I'm rooting for him, but I also want to see him fight the best to prove his legacy and prove that he is the best. That being said, Boots Ennis is unlikely because he hasn't been granted that status, and as such, we have to look elsewhere. So now we fall on Keith One Time Thurman. Keith Thurman has one loss in his career to Manny Pacquiao at an advanced age, Manny Pacquiao, but he was knocked down in the fight by Manny Pacquiao and eventually lost on the cards. It was a valiant effort, and he just came up a little short. He's returned back to the ring since laying down his title status and taking on a champion emeritus status by facing Mario Barrios, who moved up from 140-pound division to 147 for his first fight against Keith Thurman, and he loses a unanimous decision. And Keith Thurman beat him up pretty bad. He really disfigured Mario's face. Another good fighter I really like, and we'll talk about him on another video as well. But Keith Thurman used that fight to get elevated into the top three in the WBC rankings, and somehow, some way, he was granted the number one position in the WBC while not facing any ranked fighters in the WBC as well. If you follow me and Quinton Lilley on Twitter, you'll see that we went back and forth, and he feels like they paid the WBC off to get Keith elevated. I just think that that champion emeritus status was enough, even though the period of time that passed by I don't necessarily agree with. I think there should be some type of expiration. However, that status was used on Klitschko back in the day, so Keith Thurman is entitled to that if the sanctioning body granted it. Now, in return, Errol Spence went ahead and petitioned to fight Keith Thurman for the WBA ranking spot as well. So that means that he gets to put two belts on the line against Keith Thurman if they were to fight. Many have been rumored to say, or many have rumored that the I'm trying to think of the best way to put this. Basically, Al Heyman and the PBC have wanted Keith Thurman and Errol Spence to fight for a long time. It's a big money fight. It should be a big pay-per-view draw. Spence can do his part to sell a fight. Keith Thurman absolutely has the mouthpiece to sell a fight. So it's a big money maker for them. And it gives them an opportunity to keep the belts in house. So if they don't care that much about either fighter, whoever wins, they're going to get their piece of the pie. So that's the rumor that's going around. But I just think that it's a good fight because it's easy to make because they are in house. And I personally don't see the level of danger fighting Keith Thurman that there is fighting Boots Ennis, especially the danger of undisputed not happening. So, from a historic standpoint, obviously, we want to see history. Hey, go forward with that fight with Keith Thurman. Let's get out of the way. So, in my opinion, that's probably the next thing that's going to happen. The WBC has thrown their weight around before. I can see them doing it again. One thing I don't see happening is a WBA strip, and that's why stripping Errol Spence. That's why they didn't. That's why they're granting Keith Thurman the positioning that he has, and the WBC could also just give Errol Spence the franchise status, which I don't think he wants. It's generally known in boxing circles as the duck belt, and basically that status can be used to avoid mandatories, avoid fighting fighters you don't want to fight, and you can move around the division and not do the things that should come with being a true champion of your division and in the sport of boxing. So I would hope that he doesn't accept that status or request that status, and that he'll go ahead and fight Keith Thurman. And then sometime early 2022, or excuse me, 2023, maybe by the time April rolls around, or maybe even May, if Bud Crawford isn't fighting his mandatory defense of the WBO belt and he's in line to go ahead and fight for undisputed at 147, I would like to see him do so. So, in my opinion, it's going to be Keith Thurman, and then he's going to do as he said. Errol Spence is going to spin the block and come back and get some smoke with Bud Crawford. So let me know what you think in the comments. This has been your boy T Word for the Mic Check Podcast. Don't forget to drop a little something in the cash app, $ the Mic Check 12 to support the channel so we can continue to grow. Go ahead and hate, like, comment, subscribe, do all that good stuff, man. Just follow us, support us. We're gonna give you 100% content if you give us 100% support. And until the next time, this has been the Mic Check Podcast. I'm out. Peace.